listener production.
Hi, I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Welcome to The Briefing. The war in Gaza continues to rage on, 5 months after Israel launched its attack in response to the October 7 massacre. 30,000 people have died, many of them innocent civilians. With a ceasefire agreement still far from guaranteed, what is going to happen to the 2 million people currently displaced in Gaza? And are any of Palestine's neighbouring countries prepared to accept them?
The creation of a new wave of Palestinian refugees is a red line for Jordan, and it may lead to the termination of the peace agreement between Jordan and Israel.
That discussion coming up in the second half of today's episode. First, here are today's headlines with Bension Siebert. It's Monday, the 18th of March.
G'day, Sasha. The federal government has backpedalled, reversing the cancellation of Australian visas for some Palestinians fleeing Gaza. Some of the refugees have been left stranded in third countries like Egypt or Turkey after finding out their temporary Australian visas had been suddenly cancelled. The federal government has suggested the visas were cancelled in some cases where people had left Gaza, quote, without explanation of how they fled, or where other circumstances had changed.
Some were told in cancellation letters that it had been determined they had never intended, quote, to stay in Australia temporarily. The exact number of visas cancelled and then reinstated is unknown. We do know more than 2,200 visas have been granted to Palestinians since the October 7 terror attacks, along with 2,400 for Israelis.
Yeah, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that the offensive in Rafah, the city at the southern tip of Gaza, will happen and that it will take several weeks. This is despite all the international pressure against an invasion of Rafah, where so many civilians, more than 1.4 million people, are sheltering. The Israeli Defense Force, meanwhile, says it will be moving civilians in Rafah to what it described as humanitarian islands in the middle of the strip. But of course, it's not clear how these would work since so much of the northern part of Gaza is physically destroyed.
We also heard from Netanyahu about Chuck Schumer's speech. Now, Chuck Schumer is the highest-ranking Jewish congressman in the US. He made this pivotal speech last week and he was criticising Netanyahu's handling of the war in Gaza, calling the Israeli PM a major obstacle to peace. Let's have a listen.
The Netanyahu coalition no longer fits the needs of Israel after October 7th. And I believe that holding a new election, once the war starts to wind down, would give Israelis an opportunity to express their vision for the post-war future.
This could signal a really big shift because Schumer has been a very outspoken supporter of Israel. Joe Biden as well came out and commented that it was a good speech. So as you mentioned there, with international pressure over a potential Rafah offensive, this is signalling more of a change in the tide, I think, in terms of international relations and Israel. Netanyahu, as I mentioned, did respond to Chuck Schumer's comments. Here's what he had to say.
I think what he said is totally inappropriate. It's inappropriate for to go to a sister democracy and try to replace the elected leadership there.
And he went on to say Israel would continue its military pressure and continue to try to get hostages out.
And particularly significant there that Joe Biden supported those comments. I think it would be very surprising if Chuck Schumer made that speech without the absolute approval of the office of president.
Russians have joined protests at home and around the world as the country heads to the polls. Alexei Navalny's widow, Yulia, has urged people to show up to cast their ballot at midday on Sunday and cast a vote for anyone but Vladimir Putin, or write Navalny in big letters across the paper. Many independent news agencies in Russia have reported queues forming suddenly at noon, while embassies hosting the vote in foreign cities have also seen protesters show up at 12 p.m.
Yulia Navalny joined the queue at the Russian embassy in Berlin and she was cheered by the crowd lining up to vote. When asked if she had something to say to the Russian people, she said this.
Just be brave.
one day, very soon, we will win.
Vladimir Putin is expected to be re-elected by the vote, which is far from free or fair. But one of the ways that Putin is maintaining his political support is by spending a pretty massive amount of money on payments to the families of Russian soldiers who've been killed in Ukraine. Many of the soldiers come from rural and very poor parts of the country, and so these payments can be more effective in tamping down dissent than they might do in better off parts of the country. We'll actually be deep diving into Russia's sham election in this afternoon's episode of The Briefing, with voting to close in a couple of hours.
Inevitable chatter around banning TikTok in Australia has ignited as the US edges closer to it. Last week, we saw the US House of Representatives vote in favour of a bill that had forced the app's Chinese-owned company to sell or face being wiped off the devices of millions of Americans. Australia's Home Affairs Minister flagged at the time she'd be watching what happens in the US very closely, while over the weekend we heard from Anthony Albanese, who said the government has no plans to go further than current restrictions on TikTok, which forbids it on ministers' phones.
There are millions of Australians engage in TikTok and use it for communication with each other, and we think that you've got to think very carefully, in my view, before you start banning things as a first stop.
Federal bureaucrats are also not allowed to have TikTok on their phones. Meanwhile, the Coalition's Cybersecurity and Home Affairs spokesman, James Patterson, has labelled TikTok a bad faith actor, and he's urging the government to join other countries in trying to remove the influence of the Chinese Communist Party on its operations. Opposition leader Peter Dutton, meanwhile, has stopped short of calling for a ban, but he's insisting the PM consider advice from security experts, which I'm sure Anthony Albanese would say that's exactly what he's doing.
There are 8.5 million Australians who use TikTok, which is a huge number. Now, the question around banning it, cybersecurity experts talk about, one has spoken to 9 newspapers today saying, quote, it's trivially easy for China to influence Australian debate through TikTok. They can take the pulse of what's happening on the platform in Australia and then put out their own information that, they want to see spread, which we see happen and have seen happen on Facebook, particularly during elections, especially during the US election campaigns of 2016 and 2020. And I think we had this conversation, Bension, off air last week talking about, well, yeah, sure, it's a concern. It's not that it shouldn't be looked at, but why are we so laser focused on TikTok and not Facebook, Meta and Instagram? So it's, I have skin in the game. I love TikTok. I'd be very sad to see it banned, but I think obviously they need to listen to the experts about what they're saying. But it sounds like it's an issue that can happen on all social media platforms. SpaceX has reportedly been signed on to create a network of spy satellites for the US. A number of sources have come forward claiming the $2.7 billion classified contract was signed back in 2021. If successful, the program would significantly advance the ability of the US government and military to quickly spot potential targets almost anywhere on the globe. The reported contract shows a deepening connection between Elon Musk's space company and US intelligence and military agencies. Reading this article, Bension, the quote, "No one can hide," stood out to me. And I suppose it's not surprising that these satellites exist and that they're being used by military and intelligence operations. It's revolutionary in terms of how people can spy on each other now. Governments can watch us and, this is specifically in relation to military exercises. But, we know that equipment can then be used for other things. But still, it's kind of creepy to think that there are all these rockets that are going to be blasted into space to keep an eye on people. Thanks so much for being here for the headlines today, Bension. Now we're getting into our deep dive on the situation in Gaza and the refugee crisis. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza has become one of the key focuses of aid agencies as they desperately work to supply food, medicine and water to millions of displaced people. With recent Israeli offensives focusing on the north of the Strip, 1.4 million people have been forced to flee. They are holed up in the southern city of Rafah, which shares a border with Egypt, and they're facing the prospect of an imminent Israeli offensive. Given the desperate situation, you might be asking the question, well, why doesn't Egypt just take them in? That's what we're looking to answer with our guest today, Dr. Anas Iqtait from the Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies at the ANU. Thanks for joining us on the briefing today. Why can't Egypt just take these refugees in?
To answer this question, there are two important historical backgrounds. The first is the fact that the Gaza Strip's population is about 70% refugees. The vast majority of these refugees were either displaced due to fighting or expelled from the newly established Israeli state in 1948. The second background information that is important here is the fact that the Gaza Strip is internationally recognized as occupied territory by Israel. Both the Palestinians and the land in Gaza are subjugated to an Israeli occupation since 1967. So with this background in mind, the Egyptian position is backed by most of the Arab countries, as articulated in the Arab League summit in Riyadh in November, which in a nutshell stands firm against Israeli plans to put an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Gaza or to depopulate parts of Gaza at the expense of Egypt. So the Arab position is that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict must be resolved based on international law principles and the United Nations Security Council resolutions that will mimic something along the lines of a two-state solution, with the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip being the Palestinian state, and the remainder of the British Mandate of Palestine being the Israeli state. So with this in mind, I think the position of Egypt becomes clearer. Now, this is not to undermine the humanitarian catastrophe that we are seeing in Rafah and the vast majority of the Gaza Strip, but the Egyptians are staying firm because of this political background.
What is the attitude towards Gazan refugees among the other Arab countries? Is anyone currently accepting people trying to flee?
Again, the position on the current Gazan population and its refugee status outside of the Gaza Strip is highly political. It is Israel's wishes, as articulated by many of Israeli ministers in the beginning of this war, to depopulate the Gaza Strip, even to resettle some of the Gaza Strip's lands by Israeli settlers. So this is a political question and a political decision that has been made by Arab states not to go with the Israeli plans of depopulating and resettling the Gaza Strip. And the only way of doing this is by communicating to Israel very firmly that the Palestinians are not simply going to be expelled from the Gaza Strip the same way that they were expelled from Israel in 1948. And Israel has to negotiate with the Palestinians and the rest of the Arab world in order to reach a final settlement.
Have we seen Hamas play into this attitude of other Arab nations as well?
The position of Hamas is unclear, but if I were to speculate, I would say that it is part and parcel of the wider Palestinian political position, which is that creating a new wave of Palestinian refugees is a red line and is unacceptable to Palestinians in general and Palestinian political leadership and to the wider Arab world. Even amongst states that have in recent years developed better relations with Israel or even normalized their relations with Israel. So, for example, the Jordanian position continues to be firm, to the point where the Jordanian foreign minister in October and November repeatedly said that the creation of a new wave of Palestinian refugees is a red line for Jordan, and it may lead to the termination of the peace agreement between Jordan and Israel. The Egyptians have also been very firm about their position of not allowing a new wave of Palestinian refugees. So this is the general sentiment in the Arab world. There are obviously civilians in the middle, and then it makes sense for neighboring states to allow them and shelter them until the fighting is over. But on the ground, this is not the calculation at all. First of all, Israel is obviously the occupying power. Secondly, Hamas is not a political entity that is independent. It does not represent the Palestinian state. And the Gaza Strip does not represent an independent political entity.
You've really aptly described what the political situation is and why countries like Egypt aren't just saying, yes, please come in and we will protect you or we will house you. But at the end of the day, what position does that then leave refugees in Gaza in when no one will take them, but the threat of an Israeli offensive continues to hover over? Is it better to be dead or to be a refugee, I suppose, is the question that comes to my head.
First of all, this is vastly a refugee problem to begin with, and they have been living in refugee status in the Gaza Strip, which is nothing more than a very large refugee camp that is only 360 square kilometers, which is less than half of the size of Canberra City here in Australia. And they have been living in this really large refugee camp since 1948. But the important question to ask here is, why doesn't Israel allow these refugees to seek shelter in the vastly open areas in what is today southern Israel? The vast majority of these people are originally from there to begin with. And secondly, and most importantly, Israel as the occupying power has the responsibility to ensure the security of the population that it occupies. So this is something, again, that is not controversial according to international law and for various and a large number of international organizations. But we rarely hear this question, or we rarely hear this point discussed outside of legal discussions or international organizations or outside of the global south.
I wanted to ask about, and you touched on it a little bit before, which was Israel's relations with the other Arab nations. So you mentioned the normalization agreements. We know one was struck with Bahrain, Morocco, as well as the United Arab Emirates. There was progression on one with Saudi Arabia. How have Israel's relations with these countries and others progressed or changed since the October 7 invasion?
There is a unanimous position across the Arab world that views Israel's actions in the Gaza Strip since October the 7th with disgust. The vast majority of Arab states, and obviously the vast majority of the Arab public, which have been steadfast on their opposition of normalizing relations with Israel while Israel continues to occupy Palestinian lands. And then since October the 7th, Arab states as well have been condemning and objecting to Israel's military campaign across the Gaza Strip. So the likelihood of reaching a peace settlement without comprehensively addressing the Palestinian-Israeli or Israel's occupation in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem is very, very slim at the moment. Even states that were in advanced stages of discussing their normalization pacts or peace agreements, such as Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned, these states have taken a step back. But Israel at the moment is not thinking about normalizing relations with Arab states. It's mostly concerned with the situation in the Gaza Strip, as well as the very difficult political situation inside of Israel that is increasingly becoming impossible for Benjamin Netanyahu and his coalition government.
I wanted to get your take as well on something that we've seen happening in Australia over the last week, which is a number of Palestinians claiming their visas to Australia were cancelled at the last minute. Some were mid-air on their way here when they heard the news and have ended up stuck in places like Turkey because they're not allowed to return back. What do you make of that situation?
Well, first of all, I'm not surprised. It is very unfortunate, but I'm not surprised given the position that the Australian government has taken since the beginning of the war. Palestinian community here in Australia has been very clear in communicating to the government that the government needs to stand at an equal distance with regards to the Palestinians and Israelis, and the government needs to have a benchmark towards its relations with Israel as well as the Palestinians. And this benchmark should always be international law and United Nations Security Council resolutions. To be very brief on this, the Australian government seems to not have a strategy, not have a vision on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and this is disappointing.
Before we let you go, I mean, at the end of the day, we talk about the extremely complicated geopolitical landscape that is what we are talking about, which is the conflict in Gaza, you know, the relationship with other Arab nations. But at the end of the day, we are talking about people who are in danger and who are in desperate need. Is a ceasefire the only thing that will avoid further deaths, particularly in this area in the southern city of Rafah, with an imminent Israeli invasion being threatened? Is a ceasefire the only way then to save these people if we can't get them out?
Yes, one, ceasefire. Second, Israel should not be trusted with the daily affairs of the occupied and devastated population in the Gaza Strip. The Israeli military should be forced to withdraw from the Gaza Strip, and international observers, as well as regional and international powers, should take the responsibility of delivering aid to the population in Gaza. And only with this kind of approach that we can ensure the security of the people in Gaza. But this situation is unsustainable and should be looked at very seriously by the international community. And Australia should have a very clear position that is informed by international law and its commitments under international law with regards to the Gaza Strip and the wider occupied Palestinian territory.
Yeah, it's obviously an extremely complicated situation on the ground there. Dr. Iqtait, thank you so much for taking us through it and explaining it so well to us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
That is all for this morning's podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check back the Savo at 3 for your afternoon briefing. And if you got something out of this episode, why not share it with your mum or a mate? It's a great way to help us get the briefing out there. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.
Listener.